Well, good morning. It's Wednesday, February 24th, and I'm Shaka Mitchell, the Tennessee State Director at the American Federation for Children, and I am glad to welcome Dr. Eve Carney to our Choice Chat this morning. Eve is the Chief of Districts and Schools at the Tennessee Department of Education. Eve, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Shaka, for having me. I really just appreciate the invitation and being part of this conversation.
No, it's we're glad to talk with you. You know, there's just a lot of things. I mean, boy, what a difference. Frankly, I was going to say what a difference a year makes, but what a difference a week makes. A week ago, this time we were looking at, we were covered under 4 inches of snow here in Nashville, and even some, all the way west out to Memphis. Today, it's supposed to be 70 degrees. Kids are going back in buildings. Pretty amazing. And I know it's been just as busy for you over at the Department of Education. So before we get into that, I just want to tell us a little bit about yourself. What does it mean? You're the Chief of Districts and Schools. What does that mean? How'd you get to the Department of Ed, all that?
Well, again, when you said that just a moment ago, Shaka, I don't know that there's ever been a busier time, at least in my experience, that we're experiencing right now. So continuing to have these kind of conversations is super important. And what a good question you've asked me. When you have a title like Chief of Districts and Schools, that covers a host of things, as I will share a little bit. Again, my name is Eve Carney, and I've been at the department a couple of months shy of 13 years, so a pretty long tenure there. In my current role, I'm responsible for overseeing a number of divisions. I oversee the Division of Special Populations, so focusing on implementation supports for students with disabilities, English learners, migrant students, etc. I oversee the Federal Programs and Oversight Division, and that is title programs, all of the ESSER funds, GEAR funds that were given to K-12, as well as connected literacy, non-public, etc. I oversee the Division of School Improvement, so really working closely with schools that are identified as priority or focus. In Tennessee, I oversee school choice, and that would include charter and virtual schools, as well as the 4 state special schools, so Tennessee School for the Blind, Tennessee School for the Deaf, West Tennessee School for the Deaf, and Alvin C. York Institute. And finally, last but certainly not least, I oversee the Achievement School District. So one of the things about this office that I love is that we are the only division at the department that actually operates schools in several of our spaces with ASD and the state special schools. So it gives us a really unique perspective in our work and how our policies and practices actually play out in classrooms. There's never a dull moment, I can assure you, with that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a range of things, everything from, you mentioned special populations and federal programming, the ASD, which is the Achievement School District for folks who may not be familiar with that term, non-public schools, school choice. That's a lot of ground. That's a lot of students, right? And a whole lot of geography as well. So you've been at the department, you said, just about 13 years. Are you a native Tennessean? Where are you from originally? What's your story?
Yeah, so it's interesting how we all get to where we are now. I started my career in business, earning an undergraduate degree in accounting and working in the private sector. I had always felt called to education and teaching. My grandmother was a teacher in Tennessee for 45 years, many years ago. And so I went back and sought a second undergraduate degree in English. And while my husband was in law school, got my master's while I was teaching high school. And really just enjoyed, teaching high school and taught in both the public and the private schools across the state. And then ultimately made my way to the department again, almost 13 years ago. A few years back, I completed my doctorate from Lipscomb University, 16 years after my most recent degree. So I think I'm a lifelong learner on top of everything else, but it was an interesting path because I can say that kind of my first occupation in accounting has really been super helpful when you administer the types of grants and programs that we oversee for 147 districts and across our state and state agencies. So it's been a nice kind of pairing of backgrounds and experience that allow me to do the great work I get to do every day at the department.
Yeah, you talk about that accounting background, and how valuable that's been. I just spoke with someone actually this week, who was another commissioner of education in another state, and he said that some of his something that he found to be really valuable in his role as commissioner, was some time he spent in workforce development, actually, right, and kind of bringing some lessons from other industries, maybe other sectors, but into education, and thinking about, all right, how are we working to make sure that our students are ready, for whatever's next. Yeah. Yeah. So, you mentioning accounting also brings to mind the fact that I think I just read that Tennessee could be in line for another big bucket. I don't even remember what the number was, but it was, in the close to the $1 billion range of federal funds. I know lots of federal funds have gone to all the states as kind of part of all the COVID relief stuff.
Yes.
And then, likewise, with what that's meant is a lot of activity for our state legislature. And so we saw in January, we had a special session, the governor called a special session on education, and a whole lot of things happened. So I wonder if you could just maybe give us the flyover, for folks who were not paying attention, or frankly, even if you were paying attention, it's not always the easiest to understand what's happening. So what happened during that special session, and what were some of the priorities?
Yeah. And, that's such a good, important point, and it continues to be kind of what drives our work currently. But basically, Governor Lee called what is called this extraordinary session of the General Assembly. He called that in late December for early January. And it was very much on the minds of Governor Lee, the General Assembly, and Commissioner Schwinn, really just the level of great concern that this pandemic, how it has impacted our students and families, specifically our youngest learners, last spring, throughout the summer, and in the fall. And so the priorities of that special session reflected that, and that would include addressing learning loss. I think that we've had kids out of school in some places over 50 weeks in the past year. So knowing that is on front of mind for us, as well as the challenges with early grades literacy and how important that is for kids to be on track and be successful. The issue of teacher pay continues to be a challenge, knowing that we have asked more and more of teachers and administrators during these unprecedented times. And finally, accountability. This has been the thing that we know weighs heavily on everyone's minds. And in all of our engagement with stakeholders, and we had been meeting with superintendents 2-3 times a week since last March. And the one thing we continue to hear are these types of concerns around the things I just noted, with learning loss and literacy, teacher pay, and accountability. And really their questions are, trying to solve the big questions. How do we begin to recover? How do we support and ensure that all kids have those early literacy skills that they need so desperately in those earliest grades? How do we support teachers without who are continuing to just give and give, but are burning out very quickly? And then how do we balance the need to know where kids are with kind of the high stakes accountability, making sure that we take that pressure off their plate? I will say none of these are easy or quick answers. And so having this extraordinary session focused just on education was nothing I can recall one in the past like that. So it was certainly a busy time. And it really did speak to me about the governor and the governor and the legislature's commitment to education.
Yeah. Accountability, that accountability piece isn't something that we at the American Federation for Children talk about a whole lot, but I'll say, as a parent, and I know different parents can feel different ways, but this is just me talking. I can't wait to know how my kids are doing, right? I can't get that information soon enough. My kids have been, you talk about kids being out of school for 50 weeks in this house. that I sit in. My 2 of my 3, one of mine went back today.
Wow.
2 of my 3 have not been in school since the first week of March 2020. And so how are they doing? I got to know, right? I want to know how they're doing. And frankly, I do think enough of teachers to know that I'm not the best one. So I need to know where my kids are so that their teachers can meet them where they're at. And so I think it's really important. Yeah, I know that you guys get some pushback on some of those things.
Yeah.
But boy, I think we gotta be ready to address this learning loss.
And I think it's so important. I'm glad that you gave your personal example, because I think people are experiencing different things across the state. But what we know is that, especially in the youngest grades, where we're learning some of those foundational skills is just absolutely critical. The fact that we had this special session, the fact that we had a General Assembly that supported, funded summer programming for kids, not just for this summer, but for future summers, so that we can continue to give kids the supports that they need, so that they can be successful after school, after high school, and do the things that they dream to do in their lives. And so it's been a great kind of testament to that commitment, knowing that it's not just a recommendation, but certainly something that they included and were thoughtful about, also attaching some funding to that, so that families and so kids can be back in schools and can begin to kind of bridge the gaps for the things that they missed. But absolutely, you have to know where kids are, so you can plan accordingly to begin to address those issues.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, this is a time unlike any other, certainly in our lifetime, where I'm hearing from my friends across the state and really even around the country that, frankly, we are flush. Districts, I think, and states are flush with so many resources right now. We actually don't have a resource problem, as far as I can tell. In fact, we've got in some ways, the opposite problem. I've seen pictures of classrooms with boxes of PPE stacked to the ceiling. I've seen, we've got more resources than we can shake a stick at. Now we need to figure out how to deploy them so that kids are moving quickly and are on track. So, one thing that also occurs to me with the scale of this learning loss is that, frankly, for some of our most vulnerable kids, they are now going to be back in, in buildings, perhaps, and you're going to have, double the number, triple the number of kids who are grade levels behind. It seems to me, and I know this is part of you've got a really big scope of work, but it seems to me that this is now a really good opportunity for some of the kind of school choice programs that you mentioned, whether it's charters or ASD or IEA or, programs, whatever, to be kind of a pressure release for some of our district schools. I wonder how you think about, the schools of choice kind of factoring into, to this massive learning loss problem that we know we're about to see.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it. I think it's playing out in a couple of different ways. We're seeing it both at the district level with kind of this need for, or the perceived need for, virtual schools. And so we're seeing a lot more in that space than we have previously. We're also seeing parents exercising other choice options in the non-public sector. One of the programs that's in one of my shops is the Connected Literacy. It was a grant, and it really was intended to kind of dovetail with our department's, early grades literacy model, to give parents the opportunity to select a vendor to provide after-school tutoring for kids who are below grade level or who are at risk of not meeting their standards. And so when we think about even something like that, that's going to roll out here over the summer and begin offering supports to students in the fall and for the next several years, I think we're going to see that as kind of a release for that. And it seems to be something even across some of our other programs that parents are really out there seeking to determine what options they do have for their kids. And so having that Connected Literacy program, for example, we'll have we'll put that out here so that we can identify qualified providers. And then again, parents get a choice to determine what works best for their child, what modality, what structure, because there will be several options available just in that one program, for example.
Yeah, no, and I think I spoke with some folks last night, even about just the magic almost that happens when parents realize, oh, I actually have the decision-making ability, right? I've been empowered with this agency. I can actually make some choices. Parents will do that. And I think we've seen a lot of that for the past almost 12 months now, where parents are finding some really creative ways. Now, we also know a lot of parents are really struggling with how to make this time work and how to support their students. Eve, so you've been at the department for you said about 13 years, which means, if I'm doing my math right, you've seen a number of initiatives, including like Race to the Top, which, that was massive. Can you believe that we are now dwarfing Race to the Top? I mean, by a factor of 4 or something, by a lot. Yeah. How does this time, and even the energy around it, compare to maybe some of the other big initiatives that you've seen over your career? And, and what's some of the, maybe an implementation kind of bright spot that you've had that you think, oh boy, those are some good lessons that we learned that maybe we could take forward?
Yeah, I would say, just on your comment about Race to the Top and the things in the past, I think what sets this time apart from anything we've experienced is, before, where there's been kind of an economic impact, we had Race to the Top and some kind of spark of innovation there. What we have here is kind of a two on both fronts. We have a health emergency, we have an educational emergency, and we certainly have had some economic emergencies, all kind of from this pandemic. It's like nothing I think I've ever imagined. I can say that I've worked closely with districts as they're trying to grapple. I've talked with charter leaders who are trying to understand, all of the different nuances of all of the programs. But it is a time like no other. And you're correct in that there's so many resources. Now comes the important work of directing them to support kids, to support what needs to happen now, to keep teachers, to keep students learning and addressing those the impacts that this pandemic has had on them academically and otherwise. So that's been a huge one. But as I think back over, gosh, and you're right, it makes me realize my kids were 5 and 7 when I started at the department. Let's just say they're grown now. But I would say one comes to mind more recently. You may recall last summer, and this is a little bit of an ASD example, but we were, the General Assembly passed a public chapter requiring the department to develop this transition plan for schools that were exiting the Achievement School District. And so the commissioner and I had an early conversation, and it was determined that we would convene an advisory group. That wasn't a requirement, but it felt to me important, knowing the history of the Achievement School District, having lived through that history of the Achievement School District, to have various voices at the table to help us inform such an important thing about how do we facilitate a transition, hopefully that kids don't feel in the work of moving a school out of the Achievement School District. And so rather than developing it in isolation, we worked every month with this advisory group to develop this. And it felt, and I won't say it was always easy, and I won't say that we all agreed, but what I came out of that experience knowing is that every one of those individuals has a heart for kids and a heart for doing what's best for kids, even at the moment of disagreement. So it felt like the right work to know that you're doing it all from the same space, but that doesn't always mean you perfectly agree. And so it was a nice reminder that we do things better in community, often with multiple voices rather than, a single voice. That was one that kind of sticks out to me of late.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm with you on just thinking back to the time of 2008 and kind of all that's happened. So as it turns out, I was at the first meeting for an ASD turnaround school in Nashville. And so I remember that very well. It was at Brick Church Middle School, and with then the then ASD director Chris Barbic. I remember that time, and you know, just him introducing that plan to faculty members, and I remember going to one of the first, I think it was the first community meeting at I think Raleigh Egypt High School in Shelby County, which was going to go through some transitions to the ASD. So yeah, the importance of the communicating, really can't stress that enough. So now that I don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what is going to happen with some of the schools that, it's funny that it seems so controversial for schools to go into the ASD. Now it's so controversial for them to come out of the ASD. You know, it makes your head spin, but what's the plan? What can you tell us about what's going to happen with some of the schools?
Sure. And, you know, it's interesting because I think when it was passed into law at the creation of the Achievement School District, I think everyone was worried initially and rightfully about how schools come into the ASD. Even in the original legislation, there was conversation about there will be a plan, but the plan really was not developed until it was recently developed in the group I just mentioned. But going forward, just for framing and context, the ASD is actually part of a larger turnaround framework. And, you know, as someone who was able to kind of see it from its inception to where we are now, clearly there's there have been a lot of miles there. And so I think it felt right that as we near this 10-year mark, that we really take a moment and think about what we have learned, what we would do the same, what would we do differently. I think about how much the world has changed in the past year, more or less a decade. And so knowing, Shaka, to your point about the critical need for strong communication and engagement, that was probably one of the strongest lessons that I would think that the original ASD, we had to learn sometimes the hard way. But I would say this, we are committed to making sure that the ASD evolves, taking those lessons learned and moving forward in a way that it is an effective intervention in our kind of larger framework. The pandemic kind of delayed that. Honestly, we had begun conversations last spring, and we had also begun to hire a state turnaround superintendent and had to make the tough decision to pause that search back in December to just allow things to normalize. I think when we first started, we thought, oh, well, by December, things will be in a different state. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And so we've hit the pause button for now, but we'll resume that search at probably late summer of this year. In the interim, Lisa Settle will continue to lead the ASD, but we definitely know that we are addressing what transition will look like and this kind of reset as we've been talking about. We're trying to move away from one of the big things that we heard from many stakeholders is that the ASD was something that was done to us, not with us. I've heard that quite a bit. And so organizationally, we're structuring around kind of a state turnaround superintendent who's actually responsible for the full continuum of supports from when a school first is a priority school, that any type of elevation of supports that we may need to offer in this kind of tiered framework to that school becoming an ASD. And I've been saying to stakeholders, this leader will be over that full continuum. And so he or she will be as committed to a school being successful when it's first identified as it is in the ASD space. So I think it will help it feel more coherent and be something that we will address more in partnership with districts rather than it being kind of a one-off intervention that sits to the side. That's going to be probably the biggest shift, and moving away from that takeover mentality to making sure that what we give schools is very intensive and intentional support such that when we give that school back, they can sustain the growth that they have experienced, because it's not forever to be in the ASD. It's an intervention. So our hope is to make it robust and comprehensive, but also sustainable for life after ASD. So it is definitely the hardest work of my career, and the most urgent work that I do every day.
Well, I was reading some articles, and I remember seeing a comment that you made last year, I think, talking about all this, the ASD work, and you talked about really trying to respect the fact that every school is unique, and not having kind of a one size fits all approach to school turnaround. And that's speaking our language for sure, because we I would say even making it even more micro than that, we know that all students are unique. Absolutely. Right? And that a one size fits all model just doesn't work. If it did work, I actually think that we've had some really smart people over the years. We would have figured it out, but it doesn't.
I agree.
It doesn't work. Well, as we are coming up on time, would love to know, what are some of the pieces of feedback that maybe you're hearing from you and your staff, hearing from families who are thinking about, hey, what's education going to look like in the next few months? Maybe even from teachers, are there a few different issues that keep kind of bubbling to the top? What you're hearing from people all over the state, so we'd love to know what that feedback's been like.
Well, I will say this. I think because in the same way that one size doesn't fit all in the things that we just discussed, this pandemic is impacting communities very differently. And so I know that districts are working really hard. School leaders are working extremely hard to do just that. Like, how can we get kids safely back in buildings? How do we get them back in schools? Probably more, equally pressing, how do we support a teacher force who is burning out very quickly? We need them. We need them, of course, in front of kids, doing the hard work that they do every day. And then also, like, how do we give districts, the support that they need to make decisions that's best for their communities, best for their families, best for their students. And so we continue to, and I think that's probably another bright spot for me, is the commitment to this ongoing engagement with them through this process. It wasn't just, we're going to talk with superintendents and other school leaders 3 times a week for a few months. This has truly been ongoing since last March. What we know is that the pandemic continues to evolve. The issues are shifting. And now, as we are beginning to put kids back in classrooms across the entire state, now we shift our lens a bit to now what is next. And I think everyone is just trying to get enough information to make the right decisions for kids, and especially as they think about planning ahead for summer programming and what school will look like going forward. I think that there will be things that this pandemic will live on with us, and how we approach education, how we approach, we had districts and charter schools do continuous learning plans. What happens when there is another emergency of some kind, knowing that schools have been thoughtful and districts have been thoughtful about developing these types of plans, I think will be something that will continue to serve us well long after this crisis is behind us. But I think they're really just in need of information to make those many decisions on behalf of kids.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think, and I don't mean this as a knock on any one school in particular, but I think that many of these plans were long overdue. I think COVID kind of forced our hand. I think about my time being, part of the school leadership team, and I remember every year going through the safety plans, the safety and emergency plans, and there's a big binder of what you do when there's a tornado, blah, 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 blah. And all that is really good stuff. There should be a binder like that for every school, but now there's got to be a plan for what happens for an individual student when they are unable to come to school maybe a health concern, for what have you. And so the fact that now schools and districts have got those, hopefully they're robust, whatever. But in some ways, I think it's overdue. So I'm glad. I'm not at all glad for this pandemic, but I'm glad that we are thinking about outcomes, right, and not just the inputs. Yeah.
And you hope that we learn that something positive is coming from this time. So I feel like I'm constantly looking for some of those silver linings. But I think you're right. Like the fact that some very intentional planning has been done in that space, and that those plans will be continued to be reviewed and updated as we move forward will just be a critical part, and probably like an emergency plan, part of what schools and districts have on hand for anything that could come up like this.
Yeah. Well, listen, I spoke with Governor Lee yesterday, and he, continues to emphasize just trying to find the right school fit for each student, whether that's in person, remote, public, private, public charter. I think he's really focused on getting the best quality, the highest quality education that matches student needs. So thank you for the work that you're doing, supporting that vision that you've been doing for now more than a dozen years. We really appreciate you coming on the show, and wish you every success. Be safe out there traveling, as well as you're watching these school reopenings across the state.
Thank you again for having me, Shaka, and appreciate all that you all are doing as well on behalf of our kids and families.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again to Eve Carney, Chief of Districts and Schools at the Tennessee Department of Education. Y'all stay safe. Have a great day.